people who receive violence communicate through violence because they have no other language. And then it changed totally the connection to the violence, because in normal life, when you meet somebody which is violence, instead of being in the fear or being in the violence yourself, you see this person as a victim.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I'm really excited about our show today. We've got a very interesting guest. His name is Daniel Odier. He is a teacher of Kashmiri Tantra and Chan Buddhism. He's a prolific writer, and his recent book, Tantric Kali, Secret Practices and Rituals, is an amazing book that dives into the rituals and aspects of Kali. It's a compact book, but it's loaded with really amazing gems. I'm excited to have him on the show to chat with us today. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you.
So you're actually joining us all the way from Paris today, which is also exciting. We'll see how the wonderful internet holds up throughout the episode. But help us get oriented a little bit. Tell people about the work that you do. You've got a really fascinating background and story in terms of your interactions with your main teacher and the other teachers. Tell us about yourself.
I went to Kashmir when I was 30, after 7 years with Kalo Rinpoche, the Buddhist master, Tibetan master. And then I went to Kashmir because I wanted to find the sources of the tantric teaching that are still taught as they were 1,000 years ago, in a very simple, very direct manner. So I spent a few trips there, and finally I met my master, Lalita Devi.
And Lalita Devi is part of the Kaula tradition within Tantra, is that correct?
Yes, she's in the Kaula tradition and in the Spanda and Pratyabhijna tradition. But she was a yogini, wandering, living alone, teaching one person at the time in a very intense manner, even brutal sometimes. So it was very beautiful, very hard, and very direct and very fast.
I've heard you say before that Kali is this wonderful goddess of absolute violence and absolute love. Since we're going to be talking a lot about Kali today, I was wondering if you could kind of go off of that and introduce us to her. We've shared some stories about Kali previously on the podcast, but I want to kind of get your take on who Kali is and what she represents.
Kali is a wonderful goddess. First of all, she's from the very ancient layer of India. She was there before the sacred text of India. She was probably a rural goddess, and then she lasted very long until the Tantric discovered her and adopted her as the main deity, because she's everything at the same time. You don't need the good God and the dangerous one. You have the dangerous one and the incarnation of love at the same time. And it's very interesting that if you look at the poetry written about Kali, there are a lot of poems about Kali. You see that half of the poems tell about how frightening and terrible she is, and the other half about her sublime beauty and love and generosity. So she can do everything. She's considered as the creator of the language, of the Sanskrit. She is the one who is going to cut your head. I mean, to stop the mental flow in the head. And it's before civilization. She's totally wild. She's dangerous and beautiful. And it helps us to reconnect with some roots that we still have in the body, in the mind, that were not affected by civilization, the wonder of civilization, but the terrible thing of civilization too. So in a way, it's a path that reconnects us to the oldest layer we have in ourselves.
What do you say to people, in particular, perhaps Westerners, who are used to a more dualistic view of the world and a dualistic view of spirituality, where, kind of as you say, there's a good guy and there's a bad guy, there's a light and the dark, and those are separate. One is supposed to be encouraged and the other one discouraged. And because Kali is non-dual in ways that she transcends that and also includes all of that, how do you help Westerners who are less familiar with that idea, like, ooh, that's bad, we need to avoid that? How do you help them to realize the value in that side of Kali?
But in a way, too, Westerners are really fascinated by Kali, because it's so much the opposite of our culture that there is something very strong going to this place. And I think the main element in going to the Kali practice is that Kali offers the possibility to recognize ourselves in the integrality of what we are. We don't have to project a purified image of ourselves. We don't have to be too idealist. We can be very realistic about what we are in reality. And then we can stop to lie about ourselves and to show off only the quality and try to hide the very powerful things that may rely on the chaotic part of ourselves. Because for Kali, it seems that the chaos is the place of creativity. It's not something negative.
Well, and if you think of most of the greatest artists ever, they weren't like well-adjusted, perfectly saintly people. They were often chaotic and had all kinds of stuff going on. And that is where so much of their creativity perhaps came from, out of that sort of chaos, which, kind of as you're saying, it sounds like Kali can also help to represent. Now, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are at the very least familiar with this image of Kali, this woman who's completely black. She's got her tongue out, it's dripping blood, the severed heads as a necklace and around her waist, the sword. In the book Tantric Kali, you do describe some of her more common characteristics, or the symbols that we see. I was wondering if you could give us just maybe 2 or 3 of those things that we see often in the imagery, but take us a little further than their surface value and explain a little bit more about what they mean.
Yes. For example, if you take the necklace with the 50 heads, they symbolize the 50 letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, and they are turning over Kali and creating the language, creating the tantras, and creating all the sacred text. So it's a very strong image. The trident, for example, symbolizes that you are the divine, the temple, and the adorator at the same time. So everything, the head cutter symbolizes that she is going to cut the mental repetition of the mind. She's going to introduce us to silence. And then there is a cup where she's receiving the juice of the mind, which symbolizes that she will empty the mind and bring the mind to the silence and bring the body to existence too. Because one of the big parts of the Kali ritual is that we go to the full reconnaissance. I don't remember the term in English. We recognize the body as something very essential on the path. So the body is not left alone. We use the body as a vessel to the path.
As well, you have a different relationship with the ego. And throughout this tradition, and Kali kind of represents a different approach to it, where often people see yoga and things like that as, oh, we need to annihilate the ego. It's something that's wrong and bad, and we need to get rid of it. Tell us a little bit about your opinion of the ego and how, from this more integrated and holistic view, the role that it plays in our lives and our spiritual practice.
We have a very fascinating approach about the ego. We say that the ego is absolute consciousness in a contracted form, tense form. Therefore, you don't have to fight or destroy the ego because it's just a little tense. It's just absolute consciousness in a tense form. And if you can tell that to your ego, imagine you tell him you are absolute consciousness, he's going to be so relaxed. This is the most he can hope for, no, to be absolute consciousness. So there is no war against something. It's typical of the Kali approach to take everything, to unite everything, and there is nothing that we have to get rid of in order to be a Kali practitioner. On the contrary.
Well, and you say in your book on Kali, you say that the tantric thought is that the solution to a problem lies in the problem itself, and that's kind of what I'm hearing you say here. Of like the problem isn't necessarily the ego; it's our relationship with it, of thinking that it's this separate, disconnected thing. But as you said, instead it's this contracted. I like the word tense that you use, where it's like it's held in, and what all it really needs is a relaxation. So much of the tantric viewpoint is that misidentification with who you really are. You think you're the contracted one, but really you're the whole.
And anyway, who wants to kill the ego is the ego. So you never.
You can't win that. You can't win that battle. So there's some specific things that just you're such a well of knowledge and understanding that I want to dive into. But before we get a little bit more technical with some questions, I want to kind of broaden it out. You're obviously a householder. You're not a monk. You're not living off in a cave somewhere. I know that these tantric practices are very much geared towards householder life, like radical acceptance of the world and being in the world. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how the practices that you've learned and done for so long and that you teach, how they help us integrate our so-called spiritual life with the everyday mundane, wake up, pay your bills, pay your taxes, go to work, that sort of everyday normal living.
You know, in the tantric tradition, the master were like the center of the villages, you know. Most of the time they were working during the day. They could work in the field or any kind of normal work. And they would teach like in the evening to everybody in the village. So for the tantric, the master is a normal man who lives in the society and who can teach the people after he did his work. So it's not a special class of people who are specially educated, who are from higher level in the society. It could be anyone who did the practice and realized the practice. There is no sign, there is no temple, there is nothing, just a human being living normally in a community and teaching the whole community. And this is very important. Like, there is no go-between between normal human being and gods.
Which I think is important too, in the context where we're often, at least from a Western perspective, of seeing gurus and teachers from the East that are often sort of put above everybody else. It's like, okay, you can come into the room, sit anywhere you like, but not in that seat that's above everybody else's. That's the guru's seat. Like, it's a separation of that versus, as you're saying, this tantric aspect where, you know, it's, to use a similar imagery, like everyone's sitting on the floor together. Right? Like, we're all in this together. We're all human. There's no like separate, disconnected type of living, but rather like, hey, if we can't make it in the world, what's this practice all about anyways? I mean, there's that vertical, let's get us out of here, which is fine. It's a valid path to do that. But when we're living in the world, it seems like we need a spiritual practice that embraces that rather than puts us further in contradiction that says, well, this life is an illusion, it's wrong, and you need to get to this other state of being, which is completely unlike the state of being you're in now. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate not only about Tantra, but about this vision of Kali, where she's here to get rid of those things that we keep putting in the way of saying that, like, my life isn't spiritual. Spiritual is something that's happening over there in some other time and place, and I need to get there. And she's like, no. It's here, it's now. And I think that's really powerful, especially for people who are adopting these spiritual practices in the West, who are living their lives and they've got a car, they've got their Amazon Prime, they've got all this stuff, which inherently I don't think is bad, but rather misidentification, just like in the concept of who we are, becomes, well, these are my things and I need them to be happy, and so on and so forth, creates that real struggle and dynamic. Now, you mentioned practices. Now, in the book Tantra Kali, you give a lot of rituals, a lot of practices, explanations. You also talk about the importance of a teacher throughout all of that, though. I'm curious on, with so many of the practices that you have in there, because you go through a lot of them quite clearly, what do you say to people that go out, they pick up your book, and they want to learn some of these practices, but they don't have access to a teacher? What's the way that they can then approach it?
I think, reading a book could be on two levels. It could be intellectual, which is rather good, the understanding of the practice, on the surroundings, on the culture, and then you enter in the practice. When you enter on the practice, of course, it's better to do it with the teacher. The problem with Kali is that we were so afraid by Kali in the West that there are very few teachers that teach the Kali practice because they were not spread in the West at all. I think the non-idealization of the guru is very, very important, because more you idealize the guru, less you feel able to join the place
separation,
where it is. So this was struck me when I met Lalita. The first question she asked me, she said, "Do you feel that we are fundamentally different?" And I said, "Yes, of course. You are a big yogini, a master, and I am a young student." And she said, "Okay, if you feel that we are different, take your bag and leave, because I cannot teach you." So for her, I have to recognize this kind of equality before she would start to teach me. And I thought this is absolutely beautiful, because many teachers, they do exactly the opposite. They built, a kind of throne, and they are on the throne, and people, they just feel guilty and they feel unable to achieve anything. Some years ago, it was very funny. I was in a festival where there were many gurus, and the people in the morning, they saw a guru, and before the guru arrived, somebody said, he's a living incarnation of Shiva. He's a living God, and people start to vibrate, to tremble, and to cry. And then when it was my turn to teach, I arrived in front of the same people, and I say, this morning you had a living Shiva in front of you. This afternoon you have a normal man. I am exactly like you. The only difference maybe is that the troubled go very fast. But beside that, I am exactly as you are. And I could see that they were shocked, that somebody would be a teacher and not presenting himself as somebody who was above the normal human being. So I think it's really part of the Kali practice to we are all human. You can pick any master, is a human being.
And when you speak of the Kali practice, now obviously, like I said, you give a lot of practices in your book. Can you kind of give us a very broad overview of kind of what the term that you're using, Kali practice, what that entails? I know that you've spoke before about like the Tandava dance and things like that. Is that part of the Kali practice, or are we just looking at the various meditative and mantra techniques that are layered throughout the book? Can you give us a sort of a brief overview of all that?
Tandava is very important because it's the only yoga practice we have really in the tantric path, and we don't have asanas or any kind of what Indian call yoga. So this dance is very important because the whole body is working. It's opening the body, it's bringing the breath, it's opening the skin, all the layers which are contracting us are going to fall down, and it's a very energetical practice. So it's very important as a general introduction that the body is in good shape and communicating with the space. It's a love dance with the space. You make love with the space, and it's very slow. And slowness has the advantage to cut the mental flow. If you go very, very slow, the mental flow cannot continue. It stops by itself. And then you're ready to do the practice. And the practice are rather salvage, most of them. I give you an example, for example. There is something in spiritual circle that people don't know to manage is violence. And so they tell us nice things like transform your violence into compassion, for example, which is very nice, but very difficult to do. And we say, okay, now we are going to explore our violence. We are not going to escape, not to go to the opposite. And for this, we have a practice which is rather crazy for some people, but beautiful when they do it. You walk in a dark forest at night. You are Kali. And in the forest are appearing all the people who did something bad to you during your life. And as you are Kali, you go to these people and you cut them in pieces, you kill them all. So it's very interesting because for once you are not supposed to be full of love, of compassion, to try to understand. You just kill them violently. Then, after you killed all of them, suddenly something is changing. And you go out of the forest, there is a lake, you are floating in the lake, then all your violence is totally out, and you see the piece of the corpse in the space with the stars, the moon, and all the pieces of the corpse are going to fall into the lake and become beautiful again. They are going to join and to recompose the bodies that will do like a mandala around you. So you have a first circle of people, and then as you are full of love at this moment after the killing, there is something coming out of your navel like a flower and going to the navel of every person, like the umbilical cord, going to the first circle. And then there is a second circle of the people who did something bad to the people who did something bad to you. And then you understand that it's a transmission, that people who receive violence communicate through violence because they have no other language. And then it changed totally the connection to the violence, because in normal life, when you meet somebody which is violence, instead of being in the fear or being in the violence yourself, you see this person as a victim. And then it changed the whole thing. So it's beautiful because we don't negate the violence. We actually exercise it totally, even in a very wild context. And then suddenly the love appears because of the violence, and then you understand that all these people are totally related to you and that they are beautiful and that they form like a mandala with up to 5 or 7 circles. So this is an example of a practice which may be shocking for Westerners, but it's absolutely fantastic.
It reminds me of years ago. When I was living in Thailand. It was a gathering of a small group of men together, and we were doing practices. We were sharing all this sort of stuff, and there was one guy in particular that was extremely disruptive. He was being rude to other people there. He was interrupting people when it was his turn to share. He's like, "No, I don't want to share." Then when the next person started, he's like, "Okay, I'll share now." And everyone was getting very visibly tense about the situation. And the entire time I saw essentially like a big baby in a diaper just being like, "Hey guys, I need love. This is like, I need attention." And it allowed me to just be like, "Oh man, this poor guy. Like he's so starved for attention that he's lashing out like this, and he just needs our love and support." And anytime that I've been able to interact with people that way, it softens them too. It softens the situation. I mean, you find a violent person and you're like, "Hey man, I see that you've obviously been hurt," and just treat them like a normal human being. That dissolves. And so I love the context of a practice that in essence cultivates that similar experience. That is really beautiful. You mentioned these circles, and they got me thinking about the chakras. Now in the system that you work with, you actually work with 8 chakras, which might be a little different than the 7 chakra system that many are familiar with. I was wondering if you could just briefly tell us about that system, and also if you could work in the Sahaja mothers at that point, or the red goddesses, and how that kind of all works together. I mean, just a brief summary.
The main difference is that in every of the 8 chakras, we have 8 goddesses, always the same, on the 8th level. And it's a kind of constant circulation from one chakra to the other. And the center chakra is the heart chakra. And in this chakra, you have the 8 goddesses who are representing the red goddess. They are red goddess. And this is one of the highest practice of the Kali practice, is that the goddesses are traveling to reality to bring us reality in the heart and then bring the reality back where it is. So it's like a dance in the heart where the 8 goddesses are picking all the beauty on the cosmos and bringing it to us. It's a fantastic practice, of course.
I'm fascinated by the 12 Kalis, and you actually mention Abhinavagupta multiple times in the book, but you dive a little bit into the 12 Kalis and their descriptions. I was wondering if you could give us a little, I know each of these topics we could literally sit down for weeks on end and dive into deeper, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the 12 Kalis and how they work into the practice.
The 12 Kali is really a very philosophical approach of Abhinavagupta, describing this Kali and bringing to each Kali a different circle. And then when all the circles are together, it's like you have the big circle of the Kali. But it's very the philosophical part. I think it's a little complicated for the rituals, and it's more for the subtlety of the Kali philosophy that it's interesting to read about the 12 Kalis. I think a single Kali for the ritual is far enough.
Well, and something that's I find very interesting about, in particular, these traditions, and you mentioned a few times in your book, there's transmission that comes through the teachings, through sacred texts, but there's also transmission that comes through from the goddess herself, which a lot of traditions say, like, no, you can only get transmission from a guru, from a teacher. Yet this tradition has sometimes the great masters have actually been initiated. I can't think off the top of my head, but there's a story of one of the teachers within the lineage that went to the cremation grounds, and he was initiated by the 12 Kalis. So I'm curious how you feel about this idea that, like, hey, yes, it's helpful to have a teacher. Perhaps it's the sacred texts are great, but really that the energy comes from life force, from the goddess herself, and so that changes then perhaps the needs or the way that we approach our practice.
It's very important for us, this idea that a teacher is just kind of a link between the goddess and us, and it's always there in every period of time, at the beginning or 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, that when we are really ready for the teaching, through the practice with the teacher, then some strange things may happen. And among these strange things, we may have dreams, we may have more direct teaching, not through the dreams. And for us, it's as valid as a normal connection with the master. So you read it very often in the tantric tradition that people receive the teaching during their dreams. And this is important in the relation with the teacher too. For example, Lalita, she told me after my departing, the relation is not going to be different, because you will receive a teaching through the dreams. So for us, the dream is we call it sometimes the love chamber, where we meet our master and we continue to receive the teaching even when the master is dead. And I think it's beautiful, this idea that death cannot separate the teacher and the disciple.
Absolutely, I love that. Now, you actually, in your book, you have a previously unpublished in English text in there as well, the Nirrutara Tantra. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what that text is about and kind of what it's covering, just because I love it when anytime that these more source texts are being brought into the West and translated so that we can get it. And you actually have, we talked about this before we started the episode, but the story behind it is that apparently a woman came to one of your workshops and left you this translation that was originally in French, but you don't know who she is, and it was like an apparition, like came and gone, and still have yet to find out who she is. Tell us a little bit about how you came upon it, and then why this text is important and powerful.
The Kali ritual is described in quite a few texts which are well known in the West. The Kali ritual is different in one text or another text. Then one day, this woman was a Sanskritist, came to one of my workshops, and we were practicing some Kali exercise, and she was very fascinated. And then she came back and she said, I translated maybe the oldest version of the Kali tradition in this Nirrutara Tantra. And she brought me the translation, and I was so excited that I did not even ask if she put her name or address or anything. And she never came back. So she left me the Tantra. I was reading the Tantra, and at the end I discovered that there was absolutely no sign. So maybe she will see the book and come back. Then I can add her name in the next edition of the book. But it was a kind of magic, and nobody translated this Tantra before her. So it was fascinating.
The text, while relatively small, is still very beautiful and talks a lot about, like I said, the practice, but also aspects of Kali. I'm curious on a kind of technical side of it. A few times it mentions the mantra as if we were already supposed to know what that mantra is as like a central part of the practice. It does mention like Hrim, Hum, Krim, those mantras. Is that the mantra that it's talking about, or is this a particular initiation that someone has to get for that mantra, or is it just so common that people just assume that they would know what it is anyways?
Most people would know, of course, but there is something very special about a mantra. For us, the mantra, they have to be given directly, otherwise they are not efficient. So it's not a secret transmission. It's more that you have to hear it from your master to process it. And the mantra is like a weapon coming into you, traveling inside your body, maturating inside the body, and one day it can come out. But we don't believe in reading the mantra. For example, if you take the book, you read the mantra, for us, yes, it has no effect. It has to come from the transmission. And it can, the funny thing is, it can come to a silent transmission. It can be said with words, with intonation, voice, but it can be transmitted to heart. And then when it's like this, you don't say the mantra. It's like they are coming out of your body without sound. And this is considered as the most precious thing, that you don't have to do it actually. It's an emanation of your body. And I think it's a fantastic perspective.
I believe in the text as well as other places in your book, there's mentions of the importance of the internal repetition of the mantra, that's much more powerful than the external vocalization of a mantra, but that internal vibratory quality of it really becomes where the Shakti lies.
Yes, Lalita, she was very, very strong with this. When I asked her about the mantra, she said, okay, you do 20 years or 25 years of Sanskrit, and then I will tell you. Because the accentuation has to be perfect, all this. And I know that in the West, people, they love to say mantra, and they say mantra with accents from Arkansas or Chile or France, and they think it's magic. But no, it's not that magic.
So what would you say is the most distilled, the most important teaching of Kali for the modern, we could say the modern Western practitioner, because the majority of our listeners are in the West, but for anyone really, like what is the if you just had one moment to spend with somebody to impart the power of the Kali practice and understanding and worldview, what would that be? Like, how could you distill that in a impactful way for someone?
It's relatively simple. It's very deep. And it goes to the roots of humanity. So it's going to reconnect us to a part of ourselves that we forgot. And then it's going to bring us to a state of completeness where all the layer of humanity since the beginning up to now or even tomorrow will be included. And I think this is rather unique, the capacity to recognize ourselves as one thread going from the beginning to the infinite without stopping.
Where can people find out more about you? You've got a number of books out there, poetry, you teach a lot, workshops, your newest book, Tantra Kali, is through Inner Traditions. Do we find that all at danielodier.com, or are there other places to go to find about your work?
No, to my website, Daniel Odier, .com, you get many things, text, material, and you see where I go, where I teach, and it's easy.
Wonderful. Well, I really, really appreciate you coming on the show today and talking to us, especially from on the other side of the planet, and taking the time with the time zones and everything else to chat with us. I would love to have you on again. I really appreciate your perspective on things, and I'm sure that our listeners have learned a lot today. I hope they're inspired to get your book and to find out more about the work that you do and the practices that you teach, because I think we're at a place now where we need more life-affirming practices that bring us into the world instead of try to idealize this disconnected life up in the mountains all by ourselves, away from difficulty and problems. So I'm really a big fan of anyone truly that is bringing in that encouragement to live in the world, but live in a very conscious and mindful way. So again, to all our listeners out there, I hope you've enjoyed listening today, and I hope you've learned something new. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.